The most dangerous opponent of a Bf-109 pilot is not the Spitfire and not the Mustang. Very often it is his own runway. A dusty edge of concrete, a gust of crosswind, an approach angle taken a fraction too shallow, an extra half-second on the rudder pedals. And the aircraft once regarded as the pinnacle of German engineering becomes a catastrophe in an instant. After that, there is only fire and twisted metal, or permanent injury, or death. And this did not happen only at the very end of the war, not only in the desperation of 1945. It was there from the beginning. And here is the central paradox we will dissect as an investigation, layer by layer, from drawings and orders to human fates. How did the most mass-produced and one of the most successful fighters of the Second World War lead to catastrophic losses, specifically among the men who flew it? Why did a machine that produced the 3 highest-scoring fighter aces in history become part of a mechanism that ground down the Luftwaffe's own cadre faster than the enemy could? And why, by the end of the war, were the same 109s being flown not by elite professionals trained before the war, but by near children, teenagers rushed through accelerated training as if their lives were consumables? To answer honestly, one has to cling to dry facts and look at the war as it appeared to a pilot, without myths, without propaganda poster heroics. There are post-war test center reports, fighter unit combat diaries, technical summaries of failures, operating manuals, memoirs of pilots and mechanics, and above all, a repeating pattern. Everywhere the Bf-109 became a workhorse, it trailed a wake of losses that cannot be explained by bad luck alone. This was a systemic effect. It was produced by command requirements, organizational decisions, the tempo of war, and the aircraft's own design. And if you look closely, the outline of that picture begins to form as early as the 1930s. The life expectancy of fighter pilots in the Second World War was often measured in weeks. Yes, individual aces survived for years, but the average pilot, especially during periods of total war, could burn out very quickly. Sources give a broad range. From 20 to 50% of fighter pilots in different air forces did not survive the war. In German units, where sortie intensity was particularly high, there were cases where a squadron lost more than 100% of its flying personnel. The entire original roster was killed or removed, replaced, and those replacements were lost as well. That sounds like a statistical absurdity. But in air war, where the front line is in the sky, it means something simple: constant turnover of men, like a conveyor belt. And the Luftwaffe, unlike the Allies, for a long time neither stopped that conveyor belt nor regulated it. But before the war became a meat grinder, Germany had to build the instrument that would allow it to begin the war at tempo at all. And that brings us back to the origins of the Bf-109, to the early 1930s, when Germany was rearming in secret and preparing for a new global conflict. After Versailles, German military aviation was officially prohibited. But a prohibition is paper. People, resources, and ambitions did not disappear. German engineers continued to design aircraft under civilian labels, while pilots trained through a network of gliding clubs, sports associations, and semi-legal structures that later became the foundation of the Luftwaffe. This pre-war system functioned as a filter. It selected motivated, disciplined, physically capable young men. And at a certain point, the state simply dropped the mask. The Reich announced the creation of the Luftwaffe, and a race began. Who would build a modern air arm faster? And who would learn to use it as a strategic weapon rather than merely flying artillery? Germany needed a new fighter, modern, fast, with room to grow. Not a biplane, not a compromise. An aircraft meant to surpass everything in the world, and for a time that is exactly what it did. The Bf 109 was a sleek, all-metal, lightweight, high-speed fighter with an enclosed cockpit and fully retractable landing gear. Today, that sounds like a standard feature set, but in the mid-1930s it was a statement about the future. The enclosed cockpit increased speed and protected the pilot from the slipstream. Retractable gear reduced drag. An all-metal structure allowed higher load factors. The aircraft was essentially carved around speed and climb, around vertical maneuver and the ability to force a fight or refuse it. That philosophy, we decide when and how to fight, became the basis of German fighter tactics. And at the same time, the design incorporated the feature that would later kill. On the Bf 109, the landing gear retracted outward and attached to the fuselage rather than the wings. The logic was practical: easier servicing, potentially faster wing replacement in field conditions. But the geometry was unforgiving. The wheels sat close together, the track was narrow. On the ground, that made the aircraft unstable. It tended to dip its nose. It wanted to yaw on the takeoff run. It reacted sharply to gusts and to any clumsy movement of the rudder pedals. Takeoff and landing demanded precision and experience. In peacetime, when a pilot trains at a comfortable pace with an instructor, this can seem like a manageable risk. War destroys that pace. War forces you to land a damaged aircraft, in crosswinds, on a broken dirt strip, at night, in a hurry, under threat of attack. And then, the narrow gear track becomes a trap. In 1937, the Bf 109 entered service, just in time for combat trials in Spain. The Spanish Civil War became a test range for German aircraft and tactics. Where biplanes and early monoplanes had dominated, the Bf 109 suddenly demonstrated what speed and vertical maneuver meant. It wiped older aircraft from the sky, not because it was magical, but because it gave its pilot an energy advantage. It climbed faster, entered and exited attacks faster, and could choose the distance. If an opponent tried to drag the fight into a low-speed turning contest, the German pilot could simply refuse the game and climb away, keeping the initiative. In Spain, the aircraft also demonstrated clear superiority over Soviet-supplied fighters. That strengthened German confidence. The bet on a new fighter had paid off. The Bf 109 became the Luftwaffe's primary single-seat fighter. And this is where an important mechanism begins, one that later becomes brutally visible. Success breeds dogma. If a weapon works, a system tends to believe it will always work, and that the men to use it will always be found. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the 109 had already evolved into a lethal tool of air war. Its pilots were, as a rule, pre-war trained professionals. They did not simply know how to fly. They understood tactics, radio discipline, cooperation in pairs and flights, how to manage speed and altitude, how to disengage. They were not random novices. They were a cadre corps. And it was that corps that allowed the Luftwaffe to operate rapidly and confidently in the war's early years. Over Poland and then Western Europe, the Bf 109 became part of the wider blitzkrieg mechanism. It escorted bombers, suppressed enemy aircraft on the ground, disrupted counterattacks. On the ground beneath it moved columns, artillery, tanks, and that synchronization created the sensation of an unstoppable machine. From the air, the German army saw the world differently, as a map on which the enemy appeared and vanished at the will of those who controlled the sky. And here a new phenomenon emerged: the score. In the First World War, an ace was credited with 5 victories. Now, aces began to rack up more than 20, numbers that seemed unthinkable at the time. But it is crucial to understand what lay behind that. Not only skill and aircraft performance, but an organizational system. The Luftwaffe could concentrate forces, choose the moment of the blow, and, most importantly, keep experienced pilots in combat continuously. The more you flew, the more chances you had at victories, and at death. That logic would later become one of the roots of catastrophe. From the outside, the Bf 109 quickly became famous and feared on every front where it fought. Its silhouette was known over France, Norway, the Balkans, later over North Africa, Britain, and the East. For Allied pilots, it was not merely an aircraft. It was the voice of German war, sharp, fast, appearing from above and climbing away. In the first months and years, it often did outperform many Allied fighters, by speed and climb rate, and thus by the right to choose. That right to choose is the fighter's primary weapon. But this is what matters for our investigation. Even in this period, tension was accumulating inside the system. The Bf 109 demanded discipline and skill. It demanded competent ground crews, precise engine servicing, careful operation. Yet as the war widened, it began to demand not mastery, but quantity. The wider the front, the more sorties, the more airfields, the more urgent decisions. And every urgent decision pushed risk onto the pilot, not onto the staff officer, not onto the engineer, but onto the man who climbed into the cockpit. Imagine a typical dawn at a forward airfield early in the war. It is still dark. Fog lies over the grass. Mechanics in grimy coveralls check the engine with flashlights. A thin film of dew coats the wing. The air smells of gasoline, oil, and wet earth. A pilot walks toward his aircraft with a parachute over his shoulder, without any romance on his face. He knows the danger begins not out there in the sky. The danger begins here, on the taxiway, where the aircraft's nose sits high enough that the pilot can barely see forward. In a Bf 109, you often have to taxi in S-turns to look ahead. And you do it not on a perfect airfield, but on a field with ruts, bumps, stones, where after rain the ground becomes slurry. And if you are new, if you do not yet feel the machine in your body, an error can occur before you even take off. That is why difficult ground handling became one of the Bf 109's principal weaknesses. Estimates suggest that over the war, this feature cost roughly 2,000 pilots their lives, not because of Spitfires or Mustangs, but because the aircraft forgave more in the air than it did on the ground. For some, the aircraft slewed violently on the takeoff run under engine torque. For others, a landing gear leg collapsed on a rough strip. For others, a wingtip struck the ground and everything happened fast. A ground loop, a rollover, an impact. These were not epic aerial duels. They were dry, senseless deaths next to one's own tents and vehicles. And now, having seen this duality, an outstanding fighter in the air and a dangerous one on the ground, we come to the next node. the Bf-109's greatest test still lay ahead, and it would not be only about the aircraft. It would be about the system, how the Luftwaffe planned the war, calculated fuel, distributed sorties, and preserved, or failed to preserve, its people. The Battle of Britain would become the first major failure for the 109, not because the aircraft suddenly became bad, but because war placed it in conditions for which it was not designed. Long-range escort, prolonged patrol, combat over territory where the enemy could be shot down in return, while you could not. And before we cross the English Channel, we need to understand briefly what the Bf-109 was as a machine, and why its wartime evolution is both a story of engineering flexibility and a story of accumulating compromise. The Bf-109 changed almost continuously, receiving new engines, improved aerodynamics, and stronger armament. But the most mass-produced and widely used overall series was the Gustav, the G model. It used a liquid-cooled Daimler-Benz V12, which in some variants developed up to 2,000 horsepower. That produced a top speed on the order of 350 to 400 miles per hour. Its climb rate remained among the best of its time, the quality that allowed it to get above and climb away. But at high altitude, performance dropped noticeably, and that mattered. The war would push combat ever higher toward bomber altitudes, where every percentage point of power determined whether you could intercept at all. And here we reach the moment when the myth of invincibility collides with geography. Between the French coast and British airfields lay a narrow strip of water that in 1940 became the boundary between victory and defeat. For the Bf-109, it was a boundary of fuel, time, and human limits. When the Luftwaffe tried to step across it, something emerged that peacetime planners rarely consider. Even the best aircraft cannot save you if the system forces it to operate in the wrong place, in the wrong way. The problem was not that German pilots didn't know how. The problem was that their time ran out very quickly, literally. And that time was measured by the fuel gauge needle. In 1940, the English Channel looked like a narrow strip of water on a map, but for the Bf-109, it became a threshold that turned any mistake, any delay, any extra turn into a sentence. When German groups lifted off from airfields in northern France and Flanders, they climbed over the coast, formed up, and headed west. Beneath the wings lay gray-green water, often streaked with whitecaps, because the channel is almost always windy in summer. Below were scattered dots of ships and rescue craft. Ahead lay the English coast, white cliffs, and beyond it, an invisible defensive system that functioned not as valor or courage, but as a mechanism, the command's intent. The German plan was clear and, on paper, logical. First, weaken Britain's fighter force, destroy airfields, radar stations, and the command and control infrastructure. Then create conditions for an invasion, or, at minimum, break the will to resist through massed strikes. At the center of this strategy stood the Luftwaffe. But the Luftwaffe in 1940 was optimized for continental war, fast campaigns, short ranges, support of ground armies. It was an air force of blitzkrieg. Britain required something different: sustained presence in the air, bomber escort deep into enemy territory, and return across water. And here it became apparent that the most advanced fighter in the world could lose not in maneuver and not in speed. It could lose in logistics. In the Battle of Britain, the principal 109 was not the later Gustav, but primarily the Emil variants, the Bf-109E. It was fast, sharp handling, well-armed, and dangerous. but it had been designed as a short-range interceptor. Its practical range in a combat profile was on the order of 600 kilometers. In theory, it could be extended, later with a 300-liter drop tank, bringing total range to roughly 1,000 kilometers. Yet even that did not solve the core issue. Time over Britain remained negligible. The war's arithmetic looked like this: takeoff, climb, en route, forming and holding the escort formation. All of it consumed fuel before a pilot even saw the enemy. And when he finally entered contact with British fighters, he had roughly 10 to 15 minutes of fuel for actual combat. 10 minutes is one short episode. One aborted attack, one evasive maneuver, one attempt to chase, then you must turn back. And if you linger 2 or 3 minutes, you no longer have enough to return. This is the point in our investigation where the system begins to kill its own pilots. Not a bullet, not shrapnel, an escort order that does not match the aircraft's fuel mathematics. First contact. Picture a typical sortie. A Bf-109 flies above the bomber formation, slightly ahead, trying to hold altitude and speed in order to keep an energy reserve for attack. Below are Heinkels or Dorniers, heavy aircraft carrying bombs, slower, less maneuverable. Ahead are British airfields. The German pilot knows, if he breaks off to chase a Spitfire or Hurricane, he may win the fight, but he will lose the bombers. If he stays close, the bombers have cover, but he may not react in time to an attack. It is a constant dilemma, not heroic, but utilitarian. Whom do you protect? Yourself, your wingman, the bomber, or the order? British fighters come up to meet them. And here another factor appears, often underestimated when people talk about aircraft. Britain did not simply have Spitfires. Britain had a system. The Royal Air Force fought over its own territory, and that meant 3 things. First, a downed British pilot often survived and returned to service. If he bailed out over England, he would be picked up. If he belly landed in a field, someone would find him. Even if his aircraft burned, he might end up in a hospital and be flying again months later. A German pilot who lost his aircraft over Britain almost always became a prisoner. And if he went down into the sea, his chances fell rapidly. Yes, the Germans had air-sea rescue services, and sometimes men were pulled out. But in reality, the channel was cold, the seas were harsh, time was critical, and combat left no room for an orderly ditching. Many drowned or died of exposure. This was not an exception. It was geography translated into statistics. Second, the British fought at home. Defending one's own cities and families added resolve, but more importantly, it meant something practical. They could concentrate forces quickly because they flew short distances. Third, radar and control. By 1940, Britain already had a network of radar stations and a fighter control system that could detect incoming raids, determine their direction, and bring the right number of fighters into the air in time to intercept. It was an industrial, near-conveyor organization of combat. Pilots did not waste hours in purposeless patrols. They were launched on task and guided to the target. When we say radar technology improved, we mean not only equipment, but an entire integrated organism: detection, decision, takeoff, intercept. And this is where the Bf-109 first encountered an opponent that surpassed it not necessarily in speed or maneuverability, but in the ability to regulate the fight itself. The price of 10 minutes. The Bf-109 did inflict heavy losses on the RAF, especially against Hurricanes and early Spitfire variants. German pilots were more experienced and, as a rule, read the aerial situation better. They used altitude and speed, flew in pairs, covered one another, attacked from above. It worked. But every fight over Britain carried a hidden cost. Even if you survived and won, you returned home with fuel almost gone, and you had no margin for error on landing. Here, two lines converge again: the aircraft's design and the personnel system. The Bf 109 was dangerous on the ground, even in calm conditions. Now imagine a pilot returning from combat, exhausted, flooded with adrenaline, often with damage, sometimes a punctured hydraulic line, sometimes a holed radiator, sometimes a wounded hand. He comes into land on a forward strip where the wind may be cross, the runway imperfect, and the airfield in turmoil because it is itself under attack. Narrow track landing gear, engine torque, poor forward visibility. Everything demands fine work with rudder and stick. The slightest lapse and the aircraft begins to yaw, leaves the center line, catches a wing, and then it is rollover, impact, fire. Those accident numbers rose not because the Germans forgot how to fly, but because the tempo squeezed men beyond their limits. Post-war analyses estimated that as many as 1/3 of all Bf 109s ever built were damaged or destroyed in takeoff or landing-related incidents. That sounds extraordinary, but it reflects a simple truth. War kills not only in combat, but in use. And when a system begins to offset combat losses by rushing training, that fraction becomes even more frightening. Because an inexperienced pilot most often makes mistakes exactly where the Bf 109 forgives none. By October 1940, German fighter units were worn down. This was not a one-day defeat. It was gradual attrition. The Luftwaffe failed to destroy Britain's fighter control system and failed to impose a tempo that would break Britain. And, most importantly, German pilot losses were felt differently than British ones. Britain could return men to the line. Germany could not. A German pilot shot down over England became a prisoner. A German pilot lost in the sea often vanished without a trace. A German pilot killed in a landing accident became just another number, and that number struck the Luftwaffe as hard as a combat loss. And here, within our investigative line, a key mechanism appears. The Luftwaffe was structured in a way that consumed experience, the most valuable resource, down to the end. In 1940, this did not yet look like catastrophe, because the Corps was pre-war, professional, well-trained. But it was then that the Corps began to thin, a transition to a different war. Paradoxically, even after the autumn of 1940, Germany could say, "We still have the best fighter." Moreover, a new and even more powerful aircraft soon appeared, the Focke-Wulf FW-190. Technical superiority in certain parameters remained, but war is not a performance chart. War is production, fuel, airfields, training, repair depots, and above all, people capable of pushing the equipment to its limits. While the British and later the Americans built a system that rotated pilots, pulled them off the line for training, allowed recovery, and turned aces into instructors so that experience multiplied, the Luftwaffe kept its best men in combat almost continuously. At first, this produced spectacular scores. Then it produced empty cockpits. And at this moment, the war expands. Fronts multiply, the sky grows larger, and resources shrink. And the Bf-109 again appears where it seems indispensable. North Africa. Sand, heat, and a new illusion of superiority. War in the desert looks different. There are no green fields, no forests, no forgiving grass landings. There is hard ground, stones, dust, heat that alters engine behavior, and sand that clogs filters, scratches canopy glass, and abrades metal like sandpaper. On the airfield, the aircraft sits under the sun. The metal is hot. Oil behaves differently. Rubber ages faster. Mechanics work in conditions where any small defect becomes serious. The fighter that in Europe felt like a tool becomes a temperamental organism. But in the air, the 109 again shows why it was valued. In the early phase of the North African campaign, the latest Bf-109 variants often outperformed their opponents, especially British P-40s. Speed and climb again allowed pilots to dictate the fight. And again a feeling emerges. We have regained control. In the desert, where the front is stretched and air power often decides outcomes directly over columns and positions, air superiority is tangible. You see a truck burning below, a fuel dump exploding, bombs falling on a position, and you understand, if you control the sky, you control the ground. But the desert does not forgive mistakes. And it was there that one of the Luftwaffe's most vivid figures emerged, Hans-Joachim Marseille, the Star of Africa. He flew the Bf-109 and achieved a staggering tally, 158 aerial victories in North Africa alone. That number sounds almost unbelievable, but it illustrates not only one man's skill, it shows how the German system used aces. Marseille flew constantly. He was precisely the resource the system extracted to the end. And the end came suddenly and mundanely, as it often does for a pilot. In 1942, his engine failed in flight. He attempted to bail out, struck the vertical stabilizer during exit, and was killed. No epic duel, no romance, just a mechanical failure, seconds to decide, and death. And here the cold regularity appears again. The higher the sortie tempo and the harsher the operating conditions, the more likely it becomes that a pilot will be killed not by the enemy, but by a convergence of factors: wear, fatigue, damage, maintenance errors. At the same time, the Allies raised the stakes. They introduced more aircraft. They learned. They brought new Spitfire variants, among them the Spitfire Mark V, which at last reached performance parity with the Bf-109. And again the tide began to turn. Because technical parity means one thing. Now the system and the resources decide. And Germany's resources were worsening. The training problem. Here we arrive at the line that will intensify year by year. The evolution of pilot training, from pre-war elite to teenage replacements. At the start of the war, a German fighter pilot was the product of long, expensive, high-quality training. He had flight hours, discipline, method. But proper training requires time and fuel, serviceable trainers and instructors, and relatively safe skies over training fields. The more fronts, the less of all this remains. Germany began to economize. And economizing in aviation is not paperwork. It means a young pilot's first encounter with real danger comes in combat, not in training. And when such a pilot climbs into a Bf-109 with its narrow track and demanding landing behavior, the risk multiplies. Trying to improve survivability, later Bf-109 variants received protective features: armored windscreen glass, armor plate behind the seat, and self-sealing fuel tanks. These were real measures that saved lives. Armor glass could stop fragments and bullets. The armored backplate protected against rear attacks. Self-sealing tanks reduced the chance of immediate fire. But all of this added weight. And weight is speed and maneuver. Once again a compromise. By protecting the pilot from one threat, you reduce his chances against another. The aircraft still remained small and vulnerable. Its best defense was speed, the ability to disengage. Yet the liquid-cooled engine retained a lethal weakness. A single bullet that severed a coolant line or damaged a radiator could disable the engine. Overheating followed quickly. The pilot had minutes to reach an airfield, or at least find a place for a forced landing. Over sea, desert, or the front line, that chance dropped to a minimum. What in the early war looked like a brilliant machine had by mid-war become a tense balance of speed, firepower, and survivability. And that balance increasingly broke not in the sky, but in offices, where decisions were made about how many sorties a unit must fly, how many pilots could be lost, how many training hours could be cut so that replacements could be sent faster. Losses grew, and with them grew pressure on training. That pressure gradually prepared a catastrophe that would be most visible on the front, where the Bf 109 would spend more time than anywhere else, and where victory totals and death totals would look almost unnatural. Because there was one front that ultimately defined the Bf 109's legacy. It was not Britain and not North Africa. It was the Eastern Front, the space where the Luftwaffe system would operate at the limit and where its internal errors would become deadly not only for the enemy, but for itself. The Eastern Front was not simply another theater. It was a vast 1,000-kilometer system of destruction for aircraft and for people. There were no safe sorties. There were no neat airfields with smooth surfaces and stable logistics. Everything was decided by tempo. How many times you take off today, how many times you make it back to land, how many times you return before the enemy changes and your own system breaks. And it was in the East that the Bf 109 became what it truly was, a workhorse that carried the war on its back until its bones fractured. Why did the Eastern Front become a factory of aces and simultaneously a graveyard? The answer is cynical, but documentably accurate. Because in 1941, there were many targets and little effective resistance. Because the scale of the invasion and the chaos of the first weeks created conditions in which an experienced German pilot could do what was often impossible in the Western Air War: find the enemy again and again, return, refuel, take off again, and increase his score each time. And the Luftwaffe, instead of preserving such men, turned them into expendable tools, keeping them at the front without rotation or rest, until wound, capture, or death. This is the central loop of our investigation. The success of the Bf 109 and of its aces did not save the Luftwaffe. It accelerated the wear of its human resource. The first morning of Barbarossa, 22 June 1941, began not with elegant aerial duels. It began with a mass strike on airfields. In the pre-dawn light, when strips of fog still hung over forests and swamps, German groups lifted off from forward strips, sometimes close to the border. Attack aircraft and bombers went first, while Bf 109s covered them and simultaneously hunted Soviet fighters, trying to prevent them from taking off. In the first days and weeks, Soviet aviation was indeed in a grave position. In many sectors there was confusion, disrupted communications, a lack of timely orders, insufficiently trained crews, airfields crowded with aircraft that were not dispersed in time. German reports recorded hundreds of aircraft destroyed on the ground. Soviet reports recorded losses that were sometimes difficult to count precisely. For the Bf-109 pilot, this meant one thing. He often saw the enemy first, attacked first, and withdrew with the initiative. But within that initial success lay the seed of future catastrophe. Because success produced tempo. Sortie tempo is what breaks a fighter pilot fastest. Not one fight, not one hard day, but sequence. 2 sorties, 3, 4, another alert, another takeoff, another landing on a ruined strip where wheels bog in dust or mud, where a crosswind hits the tail, where mechanics work at the limit. In Europe, airfields were relatively stable. In the East, an airfield was often a field that had been farmland yesterday. And here the Bf-109 again revealed its dual nature. In the air, it was a predator. On the ground, it was a trap. A school of death. Eastern airfields. On the Eastern Front, a pilot almost always lived beside his aircraft. Tents or wooden huts, the smell of gasoline, stove smoke in winter, mud in spring and autumn, dust in summer. Mechanics were frontline soldiers too, only their weapons were wrenches and screwdrivers. As the front moved, airfields moved forward, sometimes within days. A runway could be level only on paper, and the Bf-109 demanded level ground. Narrow track gear, strong engine torque, high landing speed. On an ideal airfield, all of it was manageable, but on an eastern dirt strip, it became a constant risk, especially for novices. And the number of novices grew. To understand why, one must step back and look at pilot training as a system. Before the war, the German flying school was considered among the strongest. Training was multi-stage, from basic flying to more complex work, from simple aircraft to faster ones, from traffic pattern flying to navigation, gunnery, and group tactics. Pre-war pilots accumulated hundreds of flight hours. Figures vary by sources and periods, but the meaning is clear. This was a full profession, not a short course in survival. In 1941, that system still functioned. In 1942, it began to crack. In 1943, it was cut to the bone. By 1944, training, in many cases, shrank toward a minimum. Less fuel, fewer training hours, less time for gunnery, fewer instructors, because instructors were sent to the front as well. And here a key, almost mechanical effect appears. The worse the training, the more takeoff and landing accidents. The more accidents, the fewer aircraft remain for training. The fewer training aircraft, the worse the next cohort's preparation. It is a vicious circle the Luftwaffe created itself. And in the East, that circle spun faster than anywhere else. Why super aces emerged. On the Eastern Front, German fighter groups received an enormous workload. They covered troops, escorted strike aircraft, intercepted Soviet bombers, and conducted free hunt sorties. Missions where a group of Bf-109s searched for targets on its own. Such tactics gave room for initiative and allowed experienced pilots to collect victories. But it also meant constant contacts, constant risk, constant presence near the front. And here the famous trio emerges. Erich Hartmann, Gerhard Barkhorn, and Günther Rall. The 3 highest-scoring fighter pilots in history, all flew the Bf-109. Their official tallies were 352, 301, and 275 victories respectively. 928 confirmed victories in total, a number that sounds almost unreal. That is why it must be understood correctly. First, it reflects the duration and intensity of their combat work. They flew for years, logging immense numbers of sorties. This was not legendary luck. It was chronic, systemic contact with war. Second, it reflects the Luftwaffe's personnel policy. The Luftwaffe did not pull its best pilots out of combat to train others in the rear. It kept them at the front because their immediate effectiveness was considered more important than the future. The Allies, especially later, built a different approach. An ace might complete a combat tour and then be transferred as an instructor, so his experience would multiply through new pilots. The German system often did the opposite. It converted experience into victory totals today and paid for it with emptiness tomorrow. And this leads us to the dark side of those numbers. They speak not only to skill, they speak to a system that encouraged fighting to the end. You flew as long as you could. You returned after a wound and flew again. You survived and flew again. You became an ace not because the system protected you, but because it did not let you go. That is one of the reasons the Luftwaffe produced aces with absurd victory totals, and why so few of them actually survived the war. What combat looked like through a Bf 109 pilot's eyes in the East. Unlike Britain, where combat often took place over a constrained area and was tightly linked to airfields and radar, the Eastern Front was space. Below lay forests, fields, rivers, roads with columns, cities that sometimes burned for weeks. In the air, there was more freedom and more chaos. On one hand, this offered opportunity to hunt. On the other, it made the situation unpredictable. German tactics at the start of the war were strong. A pair, a Rot, and a foreship, a Schwarm, allowed flexible maneuver and mutual cover. In theory, the wingman watched the leader's tail and could save him at a critical moment. In practice, everything depended on training and discipline. That is why the decline in training quality would be so lethal. A pair in which the wingman does not yet feel speed and altitude is a pair in which the leader is effectively alone. One German pilot later recalled a thought that repeats across different memoirs almost word for word. Your life depends on what your wingman does when you cannot see him. That is not romance. It is a dry fact. Meanwhile, Soviet aviation was changing as well. In 1941, it was badly weakened, but it learned faster than the Germans expected. New aircraft types entered combat. Yes, in the early war, obsolete aircraft still appeared. Fighters like the I-16 and even biplanes like the I-153. But in parallel came deliveries and production of more modern fighters. The Yak-1, the MiG-3, particularly early in the war and at higher altitudes, the Lag-3, later the La-5 with its powerful radial engine, the Yak-9, and by 1944, the light, highly maneuverable Yak-3, which would become one of the most dangerous opponents in close combat. Lend-Lease aircraft also appeared, for example the P-39 Era Cobra, widely used by Soviet pilots at low and medium altitudes. All of this gradually erased the initial advantage on which early Luftwaffe successes rested. But the Bf 109 did not stand still. The Bf 109's eastern evolution, from the lighter Friedrich to the heavier Gustav. One of the most important, often underestimated transitions was to the Bf 109F, the Friedrich. This version had cleaner aerodynamics and better handling. Many pilots considered it among the most pleasant to fly. On the Eastern Front, that mattered. When you fly daily and weekly, An aircraft that responds smoothly reduces pilot workload. It does not make you immortal, but it can give you an extra second. Then came the Gustav, the Bf-109G. More engine power, more weight, more armament, more armor, and therefore more compromises. The Bf-109 grew heavier because the war demanded more tasks. It had to do more than fight fighters. It had to attack ground attack aircraft, strike ground targets, intercept bombers, sometimes carry bombs, sometimes carry external gun pods. Each new package of tasks added mass. Mass reduced maneuverability. Reduced maneuverability reduced survivability in close-in combat once the opponent no longer lagged behind. Again, the systemic logic is visible. The aircraft is upgraded because the front demands it. But upgrading under conditions of limited time and resources makes the aircraft more complex and heavier. And a complex, heavier aircraft forgives mistakes less readily. Once again, the pilot pays. Winter as an ordeal, and a killer. If the desert killed through sand and heat, the East killed through winter. Frost, snow, ice crust, short days, winds. On airfields, frozen ruts are hard to level. On aircraft, frost must be scraped away. Oil thickens, batteries weaken, engine start becomes a struggle. Mechanics preheat components, use burners, cover engines with tarps. A pilot climbs into the cramped cockpit wearing gloves, straps tightened, face bitten by cold. Now imagine landing a Bf-109 on an icy strip with its narrow gear. Any sideways drift and the aircraft begins to swing. Brakes on ice can either do nothing or bite too hard. A gust and a wingtip catches snow. In reports from those years, ground accidents appear almost alongside combat losses. Again, not romance, but operation at the limit. And the worse the training of new pilots, the more of these accidents occur. The training line. How the elite became raw material. By 1942 to 1943, Germany was no longer fighting short campaigns, but a war of attrition. In aviation, attrition means declining quality. At first, young pilots still arrived in units where veterans could pull them up. In a flight, an experienced leader could keep a novice close, guide him on the radio, and drag him out of dangerous situations. But the more losses, the fewer such leaders remained. Eventually, units faced situations where the leader himself was only mediocre and the wingman was nearly untrained. Then a pair became an imitation. The Luftwaffe's dry logic was brutal. The front needs aircraft in the air today. Therefore, it needs replacements today. Proper training as before requires time and fuel, resources already lacking. So the program is cut. Gunnery is cut. Complex maneuver training is cut. Bad weather training is cut. Navigation exercises are cut. A young pilot thus learns to fight over the front. If he survives, he becomes more experienced. If not, the system simply takes the next man. That is why, by the end of the war, when teenagers would be taking off in Bf-109s, this was not a sudden tragedy. It was the logical outcome of a process that began long before 1945. And yet, despite Soviet adaptation and growing resistance, the Bf-109 remained a serious threat to the end. Because it retained its core strengths: speed, vertical maneuver, the ability to strike first. Even as Soviet aircraft became more dangerous, a Bf-109 in experienced hands could still be lethal. And that fact repeatedly pushed the command to keep experienced pilots in combat rather than pull them out. Kuban, Kursk, and the tempo shift. By 1943, the air war in the East was no longer one-sided. In the South came the battles over the Kuban bridgehead, where large air forces on both sides fought, and engagements became massed and organized. In summer came Kursk, a colossal ground battle in which aviation again tried to act as hammer and shield. Here, the Bf-109 increasingly faced an opponent that did not collapse under the first blow. Soviet groups operated more tightly, coordinated better, more often had radio communication, and were more strongly covered by anti-aircraft artillery. And here another layer emerges. The stronger ground-based air defense becomes, the more dangerous the sky becomes even without enemy fighters. A Bf-109 pilot might win a fight with a Yak only to be hit by ground fire while attacking ground attack aircraft or descending toward the front, especially when the aircraft is overloaded with gun pods, bombs, drop tanks. All of this changed its character. It became less sharp, less alive, slower to recover speed out of a turn. Then even a short engagement could end with a simple fact: you no longer have time to climb away. And the most important point is this: all of these changes unfolded against the backdrop of personnel exhaustion. The system did not change. It continued to demand fly to the end. It continued to measure effectiveness in victories and sorties. It continued to prioritize the front over training. And at the same time, Europe was already preparing a new front in the air, a front that would demand a different role and a different price from the Bf-109. While aces on the Eastern Front accumulated immense victory totals and disappeared one by one, a wave rose in the West that would decisively change the air war. The Allies developed a strategic bombing campaign, cautiously at first, then ever more systematically. German cities and factories became targets. And at a certain point, the Luftwaffe would have to pull forces away from the East because the war moved directly into the skies over Germany. And then the Bf-109 would receive the most dangerous job of all. A job where success was measured not by tallies in an ace's diary, but by how many minutes you could survive under the interlocking fire of flying fortresses. From this point on, war for the Bf-109 pilot ceased to be a front. It became the defense of the Reich's own sky, and therefore the defense of homes, factories, railways, power stations, refineries. That sounds almost logical. In reality, the defense of the Reich was the most thankless and most lethal kind of fighter work imaginable. Because here, the pilot no longer had his familiar option, attack and disengage. Here, he was forced to attack into a zone where fire was already waiting. By 1943, German command understood that the western sky had become a separate front. The British had long shifted to night raids, eroding cities and industry. The Americans shifted to mass, daylight, precision raids, striking factories and transport nodes. This was not a single blow. It was systematic pressure, day after day, week after week, with growing numbers of aircraft, increasing altitudes, and steadily refined tactics. If, on the Eastern Front, the Bf-109 had long remained an instrument of offense, here it became an instrument of desperate defense. Defense in which every German error in training and organization returned immediately and at amplified scale. The Allies' intent and the Luftwaffe's dead end. The essence of the strategic bombing campaign was simple: deprive Germany of the ability to continue the war by destroying industry, transportation, and fuel. This was not a blow to morale in the abstract. It was a blow to concrete nodes without which fronts do not move. The production of bearings, synthetic fuel, engines, aircraft factories, rail depots. And the better the Allies understood where to strike, the sharper the Luftwaffe's dilemma became. Keep fighters in the east, where the war still consumed divisions, or move ever more forces west to cover cities and factories. But here is a key point in our line about a system killing itself. The defense of the Reich required not merely aircraft, it required pilots who could operate at high altitude, in formation, against heavy targets, under strict reaction times. It required discipline, gunnery skill, and psychological stability. And those were exactly the qualities Germany was losing, because the war had consumed the pre-war elite, and the quality of new training was declining. Now imagine a typical day of the defense of the Reich through the eyes of a Bf 109 pilot in 1943 to 1944. Altitude, cold, and white trails. The alarm comes suddenly. Radio, telephone, runner, sometimes all at once. Sirens on the airfield. Mechanics drop tools. Pilots sprint to their aircraft. Takeoff. Roll. Immediate climb. Long and punishing, because intercepting heavy bombers almost always occurs at high altitude. The air thins. Engines are pushed to maximum. Oxygen masks become mandatory. The cockpit becomes an icebox. At 7 to 9 kilometers, war looks sterile. Below lie blurred fields and cities. Above, bright sun and cold that penetrates clothing. And the most ominous sight, white contrails. The long white lines of hundreds of bombers can be seen from dozens of kilometers away. They point like a finger. Here. Fighters climb toward those trails, and from that picture alone it becomes clear. This will not be a fight between equals. It will be a fight between those who attack a wall. The wall is the bomber formation. For example, the B-17 Flying Fortress, a heavy aircraft whose nickname was not marketing but fact. In later variants, the B-17 could carry up to 13 heavy machine guns in multiple turrets. And the crucial point, bombers did not fly singly. They flew in tight formations designed to create overlapping fields of fire. You approach one, and several shoot at you. Close further, the fire intensifies. And if escort fighters are present, you are caught between two threats: heavy defensive fire ahead and fast hunters behind. For a time, the Luftwaffe could still hope to tear apart the bomber system by inflicting losses so severe that daylight raids would become unsustainable. In the early phases, that hope seemed plausible. American formations did take heavy losses, but then the same mechanism Germany had used against others came into play: industry and replacement. The Allies could lose aircraft and build new ones faster. They could lose crews and train replacements while maintaining the training pipeline. Germany, by contrast, lost what was hardest to replace: experienced fighter pilots. That is why the defense of the Reich became not merely a combat task, but a process of washing out the last professionals. Why does a successful fighter lead to catastrophic pilot losses? Because in 1943 to 1944, the Bf 109 was increasingly forced into a role that had to be wrenched out of it: a bomber-destroyer. And that meant more guns, more armor, more risk. A fighter that wins by speed and vertical maneuver now had to drive into formations of heavy aircraft, often under fire from dozens of barrels. To increase the chance of downing a bomber quickly, Bf 109s were fitted with heavier armament: underwing 20mm or 30mm gun pods, sometimes additional rockets, sometimes reinforced variants of the central cannon firing through the propeller hub. The logic was clear. One short burst, and a heavy aircraft might break apart or burn. But the cost was clear as well. The fighter became heavier and less maneuverable. It lost some of what made it alive in combat with other fighters. This was again a classic systemic miscalculation. Command tried to solve the problem of bringing down bombers through a technical fix, adding firepower. But it degraded the problem of surviving after the attack, because after the strike, the Bf-109 had to escape, build speed, break away from the formation, and evade escorts. A burdened aircraft did this worse. The pilot gained a better chance to destroy the target and lost a better chance to live. The interception method. A typical attack could look like this. A group of Bf-109s climbed above the bombers, then dove on the formation, trying to deliver a short attack, often aiming at the cockpit, engines, or the wing root. In an ideal case, one pass, one burst, break away. But ideals rarely existed in this war. Why? Because even a short pass against a tight formation was met with fire that could not be waited out. It did not look like one burst. It was a dense net of tracers, sometimes with the sensation that the air ahead was physically moving. Pilots described it as flying into a stream of metal. That was not metaphor. It was the attempt to thread an aircraft through dozens of lines of fire in order to hold the sights on target for 1 or 2 seconds. Here, psychology becomes part of the factual picture. In the defense of the Reich, you could not simply not attack. You took off because the raid was headed for your city, your industry, your railways. But to attack meant almost certainly to pass through fire. The pilot was left only with a choice of risk level: close in to increase the probability of a kill, or fire from farther away, increasing the chance of a miss and leaving the target intact. That dilemma tore at units themselves. Experienced pilots understood better that extra risk rarely paid. It was better to survive and attack again. But the system demanded results now. Young pilots who did not yet feel the boundary could press too close and die. And if a young pilot watched the leader's aircraft flare into flame beside him, his psychological stability could break in a single day. This was not a question of bravery. It was a question of experience. Experience that keeps the mind cold when the brain screams to run. And Germany was losing that experience faster than it could create it. Escort fighters, the moment the balance finally broke. For a long time, the Allies had a problem. Their escort fighters could not accompany bombers deep into Germany. In that interval, the Luftwaffe's fighters had a chance to attack bombers when they were without cover. That is why American losses in 1943 were particularly heavy. Bomber streams entered German fighter range with only their turrets and tight formations as defense. But the problem was solvable, and the Allies solved it. They began using external fuel tanks, a simple, almost uncinematic solution that transformed the war. Now, long-range fighters could escort bombers deep into German airspace. And here, the P-51 Mustang appears. Not merely a new opponent, but a factor that destroyed the Luftwaffe fighters' basic logic of survival. The Mustang was fast, had long range, could remain near bombers for extended periods, and intercept attackers. That changed the combat mathematics. Now, a Bf-109 diving on bombers risked two kinds of death at once: defensive fire from the bombers and attack by the escorts. And escape after the pass became harder, because escort fighters could pursue for a long time. Here, the effect of suicidal escalation becomes visible. The stronger the escort became, the more the Luftwaffe sought to increase its fighters' firepower against bombers. The more it increased firepower, the less maneuverable its aircraft became, and the easier they were to destroy for escort fighters. This was not a single error. It was a chain of decisions that looked logical on paper and operated catastrophically in the air. The parallel training line. Who climbs into the cockpit in 1944? By this time, the Luftwaffe increasingly received pilots who had been pushed through shortened training programs. For viewers distant from aviation, one point matters. A fighter pilot is not a driver. He must make decisions at hundreds of kilometers per hour, under G-loads, in cold, sometimes under oxygen deprivation, under fire, in a formation, with radio discipline. Any gap in training is not awkwardness, it is death. If a pre-war pilot had the chance to build skills under relatively controlled conditions, a 1944 pilot often experienced the reverse. He learned under fire, sometimes when his first real attack was against a bomber formation, an attack even experienced pilots called the most dangerous type of fight. Here again, the theme people versus system appears. At the level of an individual pilot, everything looks simple. He knows he is not ready. He is afraid. He makes mistakes. He dies. At the level of the system, it looks different. The sky must be covered. Sorties are needed. Intercepts are needed. Attacks are needed. The system does not feel fear. It feels only numbers. And that is why it continues to send unprepared men into conditions where even prepared men do not always survive. Another hidden problem: airfields under bombs. In the defense of the Reich, bombers struck not only factories. They struck transport nodes, airfields, infrastructure. This meant a Bf-109 pilot increasingly took off and landed from fields that were damaged, cratered, repaired in haste, with taxiways cluttered by debris, camouflage disturbed, constant chaos everywhere. And the Bf-109, as we have seen, does not tolerate haste on the ground. Narrow gear, a damaged strip, fatigue. Again, non-combat losses rise. When reports list aircraft lost to technical causes or in landing accidents, that is not a minor detail. It is a marker that the system is destroying itself even without direct contact with the enemy. The industrialization of the meat grinder over Germany. By 1944, the air war over Germany became industrial. Raids went in the hundreds and thousands. Dozens of intercept groups went up. And in this industry, the Luftwaffe no longer had its former advantages. Not in numbers, not in fuel, not in training. Only a desperate bet remained, that one could hit harder. Special tactics and units appeared that tried to attack bombers as brutally as possible, sometimes almost point blank. Sometimes even with an eye toward ramming if nothing else worked. The very appearance of such ideas is a diagnosis. This is not heroism. It is a sign that normal methods no longer function while the system still demands results. And here we reach the bleakest part of the picture. The Luftwaffe was losing pilots faster than it could replace them. Experienced pilots were either already dead, wounded and returned, or hanging on by sheer will, forming a skeleton crew, forced to fight and at the same time carry the young. The young, arriving into this environment, either learned quickly on the edge of survival or vanished within their first weeks. At the same time, Germany increasingly ran into fuel. This was not background. It was the engine of war. Without fuel, you cannot train pilots. Without training, pilots die faster. Pilots die, and you must send even less prepared replacements. The less prepared die, and you lose aircraft along with them. You lose aircraft, and it becomes harder to provide even the sorties needed to defend the factories that produce aircraft. It is a closed loop in which every step worsens the next. And within that loop, the Bf 109 remained central because it was the most mass-produced fighter still in production. It was familiar, comparatively repairable, and widely understood by mechanics. That is why it continued to be used to the end, even when it became obvious that in the air, it increasingly faced an opponent superior in the sum of factors. At this stage, the aircraft no longer wins the war. It tries to delay defeat. For the pilot, this feels especially harsh. He flies not for victory, but to survive one more day and shoot down one more aircraft that will, in any case, be replaced. At a certain point, Luftwaffe Command made a final, large attempt to regain initiative in the air in the West, an operation intended to destroy Allied tactical aviation on the ground, open a brief window of freedom, and ease the pressure on the front for a few weeks. That attempt was called Bodenplatte, and it would become a concentrate of everything we have described. Desperate strategy, extreme risk, heavy losses, and an effect that did not compensate the price. To understand why German pilots took this step in January 1945, one must see how rapidly Germany by then was losing not merely men, but the very capacity to wage air war. By the end of 1944, the air over Western Europe had entered a state that rarely looks frightening on staff maps, but feels like a verdict in a cockpit. The enemy controlled tempo and space completely. Allied fighters loitered over roads, hunted columns, struck bridges and rail nodes, burned airfields and depots. Bombers flew almost on schedule. German intercepts became reactive, late, ragged, expensive. It was in these conditions that Luftwaffe Command decided to execute an operation meant to restore initiative in one blow, an operation that, in reality, would only accelerate the system's collapse. The Bodenplatte concept. Winter 1944 to 1945 for Germany was no longer a defensive campaign, but a struggle for time. On the ground came the last major attempt to change the situation in the West, the Ardennes offensive. Any ground operation in this period ran into the same wall. Allied air power worked almost with impunity by day against German roads and troop concentrations. The idea, therefore, emerged: deprive the Allies of their tactical aviation for at least a short period by striking their airfields on the ground. Not to fight exhausting interceptions in the sky, not to try to shoot down flying fortresses in formation, but simply to destroy as many aircraft as possible where they stood in lines under tarps, tanks empty, crews relaxed. The operation was given the name Bodenplatte, a term that sounds almost bureaucratic, and in that dryness it is especially unsettling. Because behind the clerical word lay a simple thing: a mass fighter strike on enemy airfields at very low altitude, with a total reliance on surprise. Preparation. What distinguished Bodenplatte from a routine mission was secrecy and a bet on discipline, something that by 1945 had itself become a problem for the Luftwaffe. To preserve surprise, pilots were often not told their target until the last possible moment. Radio traffic was restricted. Routes were designed for low-level flight using landmarks, rivers, roads, canals, rail lines. On a map, it looks tidy. In the air, through winter haze under low cloud over enemy territory, it becomes a navigational trap. Here again, the self-destructive logic appears. The raid had to be massive, hundreds of fighters, on the order of 900 aircraft of various types. But mass in 1945 meant one thing. The operation would inevitably include pilots of widely varying skill, including men without enough experience of low-level formation flying, without confident navigation, without the habit of radio silence, and, most importantly, without the survival reflexes needed in chaos. What had been basic competence in 1940 had become rare by 1945. And another point, Germany's own air defenses by this stage were a separate organism, living on its own nerves. Flak gunners were accustomed to the fact that in daylight over Germany, almost everything that flew was enemy. Coordination between fighters and air defense had been difficult even in better times. By January 1945, with communications degraded, fronts shifting, airfields moving, and paperwork lagging behind reality, the risk of friendly fire became not an exception, but a statistical factor. And Bodenplatte would pay for that factor dearly. The morning of 1 January 1945, New Year's Day, a holiday that barely existed in wartime Germany anymore, but still lived in human habit. Night, alcohol somewhere in the rear, fatigue, cold, low cloud. And against that background, launch. Not a pair, not a single flight, but whole groups lifting off from multiple bases. Their task? Fly so low that Allied radar and observers could not react in time. That meant trees, power lines, masts, hills. It meant any mistake becomes impact with the ground. Any delay becomes exposure to fire. In such a flight, a Bf 109 pilot sits not as a knight of the air, but as a man physically holding an aircraft at the margin of touching the earth. Engine vibration, dense cold air, breath against the mask, constant work with stick and pedals, on a machine that forgives no mistakes on the ground and leaves no time to correct them at low level. When the strike worked, it looked brutally effective. An airfield, aircraft parked in rows, taxiways leading to dispersals. In some places, mechanics are not yet at their aircraft. In others, alert crews do not have time to scramble. Fighters roar in at low altitude and open fire into parking areas, hangars, lines of aircraft. In such conditions, one does not need great skill. One needs speed, direction, and the ability to fire at the right moment. On the ground, Spitfires, Tempests, Typhoons, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, light bombers and attack aircraft burn. Fuel drums explode. Tires ignite. Flames reflect in the attacker's canopy. It looks like success, but Bodenplatte success is success measured in seconds. War is measured in hours and months. The cost. Trouble began on the routes. In winter, low cloud and haze erase landmarks. Some groups lost the track. Some attacked the wrong airfields. Some came under flak early. Some lost aircraft before reaching targets, simply because low-level formation flight with mixed skill inevitably produces accidents. Then came the defense of the airfields. Even surprised, an airfield is not defenseless. Flak positions around dispersals, small arms, fighters that manage to get airborne. The Bf 109 pilot now faced not merely execute the attack, but survive it. Survival often meant crossing space already filled with tracers, from the ground and from the air. And finally, the most painful phase, the return. Pilots who made it back were sometimes hit by their own guns. German air defense on that day might not have expected a mass return of fighters at low altitude. With poor communications, unclear recognition signals, and a general state of strain, many German aircraft were engaged by their own flak. It sounds absurd, but by 1945 the war itself had become absurd. A system attempting one last lunge literally destroyed itself on the way home. Yes, the Allies lost many aircraft on the ground, but the Allies possessed what Germany no longer had: industrial depth, fuel, and, above all, personnel stability. Damaged machines were replaced. New aircraft were ferried forward from factories and rear airfields. Pilots moved through a stable training pipeline. Aircraft park losses were made good. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, lost what was effectively irreplaceable: experienced pilots, flight and squadron leaders, the people who held discipline and tactics together. In reports, the operation could look partially successful. In reality, it was a Pyrrhic blow, too expensive and without strategic effect. And here the link to our central question becomes unavoidable. Why did the most mass-produced and successful fighter lead to catastrophic pilot losses? Because by 1945, the Bf 109 was being used as a tool meant to compensate for systemic collapse of training, fuel, and personnel reserve. It was thrown into tasks that demanded high-level piloting, but were given to men with minimal experience. It was overloaded with armament for bomber interception, reducing maneuverability against escort fighters. It was driven at tempos that increased ground accidents, on an aircraft with narrow landing gear that punished small errors in landing. And when the moment of a last lunge arrived, it was the Bf 109 that received those whom the system had not had time to make into pilots in the full sense. After Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe had almost no room left to maneuver. Fuel. By spring 1945, the fuel problem became the key fact that explains almost everything. Without fuel, you cannot train. Without training, you cannot prepare pilots. Without preparation, pilots die faster, and the loop closes again. Moreover, fuel is not only quantity, but quality. Late in the war, Germany increasingly relied on synthetic fuels of varying composition and properties, which affected engine operation. Mechanics worked amid severe shortages of parts. Aircraft were cannibalized, components taken from one machine to get another airborne. Any delay on the ground meant a missed intercept. The result was a nervous sortie rhythm: short alerts, short interceptions, short combats. And any short episode could be the last. Training. From elite to teenagers, the terminal stage. When people say teenagers in cockpits, it is important not to drift into myth. This is not a claim that every aircraft was flown by a child. It means that by the end of the war, the age and experience threshold dropped noticeably, and the quality of training fell to levels previously considered unacceptable. In some cases, young pilots arrived at frontline units with extremely limited flight time. They were pushed through quickly because the front demanded, "Cover the sky now." If in 1940 a Luftwaffe fighter pilot could still be treated as an elite, in 1945 the system increasingly treated him as a consumable element. That is not moralizing. It is the arithmetic of loss. A young pilot who has barely mastered a demanding aircraft receives a mission to intercept bombers protected by Mustangs. He must take off from a damaged strip, climb rapidly, enter combat, withstand G-loads, shoot accurately, break away, and land. Even experienced pilots did not always manage it. Young pilots often disappeared in their first weeks. And this further weakened the system. because every dead novice was not only a man lost, it was an aircraft lost, fuel lost, mechanic hours lost, and the loss of any chance that this novice might one day become a leader. This is how the Luftwaffe system killed itself. Sonderkommando Elbe, the symptom of agony. When normal methods stop working, what appears is what historians usually call desperate measures. But desperate measures are not a flash of madness. They are a rational reaction by a system that has run out of resources. If you cannot reliably intercept bombers in the conventional way, because escort fighters destroy you, because you lack fuel for training and interception, because your pilots do not have time to become experienced, you begin looking for a way to bypass reality. Thus emerged Sonderkommando Elbe, a special unit of volunteers tasked with ramming Allied bombers. Not as a beautiful legend of a heroic blow, but as a pragmatic attempt to offset a shortage of firepower and experience through the crudest physics: aircraft against aircraft. For this purpose, Bf-109s could be lightened, non-essential equipment removed, and armament sometimes reduced to a minimum, because the objective was not fight, but close and collide. In effect, it was an admission at the staff level: we can no longer guarantee bomber kills by ordinary means. On 7 April 1945, one of the best-known missions of this type took place. Dozens of Bf-109s, by some accounts 100 or more, rose to engage American bomber formations. The results were limited. A small number of bombers were destroyed, while German losses were overwhelming. Most of the pilots were shot down before they could reach the formation, killed attempting the ramming attack, or captured. This was not about a spirit of sacrifice. It was about system decomposition to the point where human lives were being exchanged for seconds of delay in the bomber stream. The last months of the Bf-109, a machine that still flies but can no longer change anything. Spring 1945 was no longer a struggle for initiative, but a struggle for fragments of space. In some areas, isolated intercepts still rose. In others, a handful of fighters were gathered to cover a retreating column. Elsewhere, pilots still tried to attack enemy ground attack aircraft, but the overall pattern was the same. Too few aircraft in the air, too little fuel, too little time. In the west, the Allies advanced to and beyond the Rhine. Over Germany, the bombing continued without pause. In the east, the Red Army approached Berlin. Luftwaffe fighter units were split between two fronts. Many airfields were lost or destroyed. Supply collapsed. Mechanics worked with what remained. Pilots sometimes flew aircraft that pre-war test authorities would never have released. Here, the Bf-109 remained central simply because it existed in large numbers. It was the most common platform. Mechanics knew it. It could be kept flying through cannibalized parts. It could still be put into the air. And it remained dangerous if an experienced pilot sat in the cockpit. But experienced pilots were almost gone. Imagine the final days of the war in the air. An airfield that is no longer an airfield, but a stretch of road or a field at the edge of a town. Craters nearby, camouflage nets and branches. A young pilot, a face not yet hardened to war, an exhausted gaze. He tightens the harness, puts on the goggles, receives a short order. Intercept a ground attack group, cover a withdrawal, try to shoot down anything at all. He knows fuel is scarce, radio may fail. The enemy is more numerous and better coordinated. He still takes off, because this is what the system does. It replaces the dead with the next. Over Berlin, over central Germany, over roads packed with refugees and retreating units, the Bf-109 flew its last sorties. in April and May 1945. These were no longer battles in the classic sense. They were episodes of survival in a sky where the enemy controlled altitude, speed, and numbers. The end of the investigation. If you strip away myth and leave only causal chains, the picture becomes cold and clear. The Bf-109 really was an outstanding fighter, especially in the first half of the war. It was fast, climbed well, and had room for modernization. It gave the Luftwaffe air superiority in early campaigns. It became the platform on which record-setting aces emerged. But success and mass production made it part of a system that began consuming men faster than the enemy could. Because the aircraft had a design feature that made takeoff and landing dangerous, especially for inexperienced pilots and on poor strips. In wartime conditions, this turned the airfield itself into a source of losses. The Luftwaffe failed to build a stable personnel policy that rotated pilots and preserved experience. Its best men were kept at the front to the end, rather than turned into instructors who would multiply experience. That produced records and destroyed the future. As the Allies grew stronger, the Bf-109 was increasingly used not as a light predator, but as a platform for heavy anti-bomber armament that reduced maneuverability and increased vulnerability against escort fighters. Fuel shortages and industrial destruction struck at the heart of training. When training is cut, pilots die faster. When pilots die faster, training is cut further. That vicious circle became irreversible by 1945. Finally, strategic reality forced the Luftwaffe to fight on the enemy's terms, over hostile territory in 1940, under the umbrella of Allied escort fighters in 1944, and over a collapsing homeland in 1945. In such conditions, even the best aircraft becomes only a means to delay the inevitable. In the end, the Bf-109 became not only a symbol of German aviation, but a symbol of how technology and organizational policy can combine into a mechanism of self-exhaustion. It gave pilots a chance to become aces and simultaneously placed them in conditions where the chance to survive shrank year by year. And perhaps the most unsettling conclusion is not that war is cruel. That phrase is too general. The unsettling conclusion is different. Decisions that look rational at a headquarters desk are not measured in map lines and report figures. They are measured in how many times a living human being can close the canopy, roll for takeoff, endure the G-loads, put rounds on target, and then return to a runway where half a second of error turns metal into a grave. If you watch this story to the end, write in the comments what you believe was the decisive factor in the Luftwaffe's collapse: aircraft design, fuel, personnel policy, or strategy. And if you want the next analysis in the same documentary format, support the episode with a subscription.